Okay, we return to The Plague, Part 2, Episode 4. Episode 5. We're moving right along here. And we left at the bottom of page 105. We pick up on 106. It was Taru who had asked Ryu for the interview he refers to in his diary. On that evening, as it happened, just before Taru arrived, the doctor had gazed for some moments at his mother, who was sitting very still in the corner of the dining room. Once her household tasks were over, she spent most of her time in that chair. Her hands folded in her lap, she sat there waiting. Rhea wasn't even sure it was for him she waited. However, something always changed in his mother's face when he came in. The silent resignation that a laborious life had given it seemed to light up with a sudden glow. Then she returned to her tranquility. That evening she was gazing out of the window at the now empty street. The street lighting had been reduced by 2/3, and only at long intervals a lamp cast flickering gleams through the thick darkness of the town. "Will they keep to the reduced lighting as long as the plague lasts?" Madame Rieu asked. "I expect so. Let's hope it doesn't last till winter. It would be terribly depressing." "Yes," Rieu said. He saw his mother's gaze settle on his forehead. He knew that the worry and overwork of the last few days had scored their traces there. "Didn't things go well today?" his mother asked. "Oh, much as usual." As usual. That was to say, the new consignment of serum sent from Paris seemed less effective than the first, and the death rate was rising. It was still impossible to administer prophylactic inoculations elsewhere than in families already attacked. If its use was to be generalized, very large quantities of the vaccine would have been needed. Most of the buboes refused to burst. It was as if they underwent a seasonal hardening, and the victims suffered horribly. During the last 24 hours, there had been 2 cases of a new form of the epidemic. The plague was becoming pneumonic. On this very day, in the course of a meeting, the much harassed doctors had pressed the prefect. The unfortunate man seemed quite at his wits' end to issue new regulations to prevent the contagion from being carried from mouth to mouth, as happens in pneumonic plague. The prefect has done as they wished, but as usual they were groping more or less in the dark. Looking at his mother, he felt an uprush of a half-forgotten emotion, the love of his boyhood, at the sight of her soft brown gaze intent on him. "Don't you ever feel alarmed, Mother?" "Oh, at my age there isn't much left to fear. The days are very long, and just now I'm hardly ever at home, though." "Well, I don't mind waiting, and I know you're going to come back. And when you aren't here, I think of what you're doing. Have you any news?" "Yes, if I'm to believe the last telegram, everything's going as well as could be expected, but I know she says that to prevent my worrying." The doorbell rang. The doctor gave his mother a smile and went to open the door. In the dim light of the landing, Taru looked like a big gray bear. Ryu gave his visitor a seat facing his desk, while he himself remained standing behind the desk chair. Between them was the only light in the room, a desk lamp. Taru came straight to the point. "I know," he said, "that I can talk to you quite frankly." Ryu nodded. "In a fortnight or a month at most," Taru continued, "you'll serve no purpose here. Things will have got out of hand." "I agree. The sanitary department is inefficient, understaffed for one thing, and you're worked off your feet." Rhea admitted this was so. "Well," Taru said, "I've heard that the authorities are thinking of a sort of conscription of the population, and all men in good health will be required to help in fighting the plague." Your information was correct, but the authorities are in none too good odor as it is, and the prefect can't make up his mind. "Well, if he daren't risk the compulsion, why not call for voluntary help?" "Well, it's been done." The response was poor. "It was done through official channels and half-heartedly. What they're short on is imagination. Officialdom can never cope with something really catastrophic, and the remedial measures they think up are hardly adequate for a common cold. If we let them carry on like this, they'll soon be dead, and so shall we." "That's more than likely," Rhea said. "I should tell you, however, that they're thinking of using the prisoners in the jails for just what we call the heavy work. I'd rather free men were employed." "So would I, but I might ask why you feel like that." "I loathe men's being condemned to death." Rio looked at Taru in the eyes. "So what?" he asked. "It's this I have to say. I've drawn up a plan for voluntary groups of helpers. Get me empowered to try out my plan, and then let's sidetrack officialdom. In any case, the authorities have their hands more than full already. I have friends in many walks of life. They'll form a nucleus to start from, and of course I'll take part in it myself." I need hardly tell you, Rio replied, that I accept your suggestion most gladly. One can't have too many helpers, especially in a job like mine under present conditions. I undertake to get your plan approved by the authorities. Anyhow, they've no choice. But, Rio pondered, but I take it you know that work of this kind may prove fatal to the worker, and I feel that I should ask you this. Have you weighed the dangers? Teru's gray eyes met the doctor's gaze serenely. What did you think of Panalu's sermon, doctor? The question was asked in a quite ordinary tone, and Ria answered in the same tone. I have seen too much of hospitals to relish any idea of collective punishment, but as you know, Christians sometimes say that sort of thing without really thinking it. They're better than they seem. However, you think, like Panalu, that the plague has its good side. It opens men's eyes and forces them to take thought. The doctor tossed his head impatiently. So does every ill that flesh is heir to. What's true of all the evils in the world is true of plague as well. It helps men to rise above themselves. All the same, when you see the misery it brings, you'd need to be a madman or a coward or stone blind to give in tamely to the plague. Rio had hardly raised his voice at all, but Teru made a slight gesture as if to calm him. He was smiling. Yes, Rio shrugged his shoulders. But you haven't answered my question yet. Have you weighed the consequences? Teru squared his shoulders against the back of the chair, then moved his head forward into the light. Do you believe in God, doctor? Again, the question was put in an ordinary tone, but this time Rio took longer to find his answer. No, but what does that really mean? I'm fumbling in the dark, struggling to make something out, but I've long ceased finding that original. Isn't that it, then, the great gulf between Panalu and you? I doubt it, Ryu said. Panalu is a man of learning, a scholar. He hasn't come in contact with death. That's why he can speak with such assurance of the truth, with a capital T. But every country priest who visits his parishioners and has heard a man gasping for breath on his deathbed thinks as I do. He'd try to relieve human suffering before trying to point out its excellence. Ryu stood up, his face now in shadow. Let's drop the subject, he said, as he won't answer. Teru remained seated in his chair. He was smiling again. Suppose I answer with a question. The doctor now smiled too. You like being mysterious, don't you? Yes, fire away. My question's this, said Teru. Why do you yourself show such devotion, considering you don't believe in God? I suspect your answer may help me to mine. His face still in shadow, Ryu said that he had already answered, that if he believed in an all-powerful God, he would cease curing the sick and leave that to him. But no one in the world believed in a God of that sort. No, not even Panalu, who believed that he believed in such a God. And this was proved by the fact that no one ever threw himself on Providence completely. Anyhow, in this respect, Ryu believed himself to be on the right road, in fighting against creation as he found it. Ah, Teru remarked. So that's the idea you have of your profession. More or less, the doctor came back into the light. Teru made a faint whistling noise with his lips, and the doctor gazed at him. Yes, you're thinking it calls for pride to feel that way, but I assure you I've no more than the pride that's needed to keep me going. I have no idea what's awaiting me, or what will happen when all this ends. For the moment I know this, there are sick people and they need curing. Later on, perhaps, they'll think things over, and so shall I. But what's wanted now is to make them well. I defend them as best I can. That's all. Against whom? Ryu turned to the window. A shadow line on the horizon told of the presence of the sea. He was conscious only of his exhaustion, and at the same time was struggling against the sudden irrational impulse to unburden himself a little more to his companion, an eccentric perhaps, but who, he guessed, was one of his own kind. I have a notion, Teru. I assure you, I haven't a notion. I haven't a notion, Teru. I assure you, I haven't a notion. When I entered this profession, I did it abstractly, so to speak, because I had a desire for it, because it meant a career like another, one that young men often aspire to. Perhaps, too, it was particularly difficult for a workman's son like myself. And then I had to see people die. Do you know that there are some people who refuse to die? Have you ever heard a woman scream, "Never!" with her last gasp? Well, I have, and then I saw that I can never get hardened to it. I was young then, and I was outraged by the whole scheme of things, or so I thought. Subsequently, I grew more modest. Only, I've never managed to get used to seeing people die. That's all I know, yet after all. Ryu fell silent and sat down. He felt his mouth dry. After all? Teru prompted softly. After all, the doctor repeated, then hesitated again, fixing his eyes on Teru. It's something that a man of your sort can understand most likely. But since the order of the world is shaped by death, mightn't it be better for God if we refuse to believe in him and struggle with all our might against death without raising our eyes towards the heaven where he sits in silence? True nodded. Yes, but your victories will never be lasting, that's all. Rio's face darkened. Yes, I know that, but it's no reason for giving up the struggle. No reason, I agree, only I now can picture what this plague must mean for you. Yes, a never-ending defeat. Tarrou stared at the doctor for a moment, then turned and tramped heavily toward the door. Ryu followed him and was almost at his side when Tarrou, who was staring at the floor, suddenly said, Who taught you all this, doctor? The reply came promptly, Suffering. Ryu opened the door of his surgery and told Tarrou that he too was going out. He had a patient to visit in the suburbs. Tarrou suggested they should go together, and he agreed. In the hall, they encountered Madame Ryu, and the doctor introduced Tarrou to her. A friend of mine, he said. Indeed, said Madame Ryu, I'm very pleased to make your acquaintance. When she left them, Tarrou turned to gaze after her. On the landing, the doctor pressed the switch to turn on the lights along the stairs, but the stairs remained in darkness. Possibly some new light-saving order had come into force. Really, however, there was no knowing. For some time past in the streets, no less than in the private houses, everything had been going out of order. It may only be that the current concierge, like nearly everyone in the town, was ceasing to bother about his duties. The doctor had no time to follow up his thoughts. Tarrou's voice came from behind him. Just one more word, doctor, even if it sounds to you a bit nonsensical. You are perfectly right. The doctor merely gave a little shrug, unseen in the darkness. To tell you the truth, all that's outside my range, but you, what do you know about it? Ah, Tarrou replied coolly. I've little left to learn. Ryu paused, and behind him, Tarrou's foot slipped on a step. He steadied himself by gripping the doctor's shoulder. Do you really imagine you know everything about life? The answer came through the darkness in the same cool, confident tone. Yes. Once in the street, they realized it must be quite late, 11 perhaps. All was silence in the town, except for some vague rustlings. An ambulance bell clanged faintly in the distance. They stepped into the car, and Ryu started the engine. You must come to the hospital tomorrow, he said, for an injection. But before embarking on this adventure, you better know that your chances of it coming out alive, they're 1 in 3. That sort of reckoning doesn't hold water. You know it, doctor, as well as I. 100 years ago, plague wiped out the entire population of a town in Persia with one exception, and the sole survivor was precisely the man whose job it was to wash the dead bodies, who carried on throughout the epidemic. He pulled off his 1 in 3 chance, that's all, Ryu had lowered his voice. But you're right, we know next to nothing on the subject. They were entering the suburbs. The headlights lit up empty streets. The car stopped. Standing in front of it, Ryu asked Tarrou if he'd like to come in. Tarrou said, yes. A glimmer of light from the sky lit up their faces. Suddenly, Ryu gave a short laugh, and there was much friendliness in it. Out with it, Tarrou. What on earth prompted you to take a hand in this? I don't know. My code of morals, perhaps? Your code of morals? What code? Comprehension. Tarrou turned toward the house, and Ryu did not see his face again until they were in the old asthma patient's room. Next day, Tarrou set to work and enrolled a first team of workers, soon to be followed by many others. However, it is not the narrator's intention to ascribe to these sanitary groups more importance than their due. Doubtless today many of our fellow citizens are apt to yield to the temptation of exaggerating the services they rendered. But the narrator is inclined to think that by attributing overimportance to praiseworthy actions, one may, by implication, be paying indirect but potent homage to the worst side of human nature. For this attitude implies that such actions shine out as rare exceptions, while callousness and apathy are the general rule. The narrator does not share that view. The evil that is in the world always comes of ignorance, and good intentions may do as much harm as malevolence if they lack understanding. On the whole, men are more good than bad. That, however, isn't the real point. But they are more or less ignorant, and it is this that we call vice or virtue. The most incorrigible vice being that of an ignorance that fancies it knows everything and therefore claims for itself the right to kill. The soul of the murderer is blind. There can be no true goodness nor true love without the utmost clear-sightedness. Hence, the sanitary groups whose creation was entirely Tarrou's work should be considered with objectivity as well as with approval. And this is why the narrator declines to vaunt in overglowing terms a courage and a devotion to which he attributes only a relative and reasonable importance. But he will continue with the chronicler of the troubled, rebellious hearts of our townspeople under the impact of the plague. Those who enrolled in the sanitary squads, as they were called, had indeed no such great merit in doing as they did, since they knew it was the only thing to do, and the unthinkable thing would have been not to have brought themselves to do it. These groups enabled our townsfolk to come to grips with the disease and convinced them that, now that the plague was among us, it was up to them to do whatever could be done to fight it. Since the plague became in this way some men's duty, it revealed itself as what it really was, that is, the concern of all. So far, so good. But do we not congratulate a schoolmaster on teaching that 2 and 2 make 4, that we may perhaps congratulate him on having chosen his laudable vocation? Let us then say that it was praiseworthy that Tarrou and so many others should have elected to prove that 2 and 2 make 4 rather than the contrary. But let us add that this good will of theirs was one that is shared by the schoolmaster and by all who have the same feelings as the schoolmaster, and, be it said to the credit of mankind, they are more numerous than one would think. Such, anyhow, is the narrator's conviction. Needless to say, he can see quite clearly a point that could be made against him, which is that these men were risking their lives. But again and again there comes a time in history when the man who dares to say that 2 and 2 make 4 is punished with death. The school teacher is well aware of this, and the question is not one of knowing what punishment or reward attends the making of this calculation. The question is that of knowing whether 2 and 2 do make 4. For those of our townsfolk who risked their lives in this predicament, the issue was whether or not the plague was in their midst, and whether or not they must fight against it. Many fledgling moralists in those days were going about our town proclaiming there was nothing to be done about it, and we should bow to the inevitable. And Tarrou, Rieux, and their friends might give one answer or another, but its conclusion was always the same. Their certitude that a fight must be put up, in this way or that, there must be no bowing down. The essential thing was to save the greatest possible number of persons from dying and being doomed to unending separation. And to do this, there was only one resource: to fight the plague. There was nothing admirable about this attitude. It was merely logical. Thus it was only natural that old Dr. Castell should plod away with unshaken confidence, never sparing himself at making anti-plague serum on the spot with the makeshift equipment at his disposal. Rieux shared his hope that a vaccine made with cultures of the bacilli obtained locally would take effect more actively than serum coming from outside, since the local bacillus differed slightly from the normal plague bacillus as defined in textbooks of tropical diseases. And Castell expected to have his first supply ready within a surprisingly short period. That, too, is why it was natural that Grand, who had nothing of the hero about him, should now be acting as a sort of general secretary to the sanitary squads. A certain number of the groups organized by Tarrou were working in the congested areas of the town, with a view to improving the sanitary conditions there. Their duties were to see that houses were kept in a proper hygienic state and to list attics and cellars that had not been disinfected by the official sanitary service. Other teams of volunteers accompanied the doctors on their house-to-house visits and saw to the evacuation of infected persons, and subsequently, owing to the shortage of drivers, even drove the vehicles conveying sick persons and dead bodies. All this involved the upkeep of registers and statistics, and Grand undertook the task. From this angle, the narrator holds that, more than Rieux or Tarrou, Grand was the true embodiment of the quiet courage that inspired the sanitary groups. He had said yes without a moment's hesitation, and with a large heartiness that was second nature to him. All he had asked was to be allowed light duties, for he was too old for anything else. He could give his time from 6 to 8 every evening. When Rieux thanked him with some warmth, he seemed surprised. "Why, that's not difficult. Plague is here, and we've got to make a stand. That's obvious. I only wish everything were as simple." And he went back to this phrase. Sometimes in the evening, when he had filed his reports and worked out his statistics, Grand and Rieux would have a chat. Soon they formed the habit of including Tarrou in their talks, and Grand unburdened himself with increasingly apparent pleasure to his two companions. They began to take a genuine interest in his laborious literary task to which he was applying himself, while the plague raged around him. Indeed, they, too, found in it a relaxation of the strain. "How is your young lady on horseback progressing?" Tarrou would ask, and invariably Grand would answer with a wry smile, "Trotting along, trotting along." One evening, Grand announced that he had definitively discarded the adjective elegant for this horsewoman. From now on, it was replaced by slim. That's more concrete, he explained. Soon after, he read out to his two friends the new version of the sentence. One fine morning in May, a slim young horsewoman might have been seen riding a handsome sorrel mare along the flowery avenues of the Bois de Boulogne. Don't you agree with me that one sees her better that way? And I've put one fine morning in May because in the month of May tended rather to drag out the trot, if you see what I mean. Next, he showed some anxiety about the adjective handsome. In his opinion, it didn't convey enough, and he set to looking for an epithet that would promptly and clearly photograph the superb animal he saw with his mind's eye. Plump wouldn't do, though concrete enough, it sounded perhaps a little disparaging, also a shade vulgar. Beautifully groomed had tempted him for a moment, but it was cumbrous and made the rhythm limp somewhat. Then one evening he announced triumphantly that he had got it. A black sorrel mare. To his thinking, he explained, black conveyed a hint of elegance and opulence. It won't do, Ryu said. Why not? Because sorrel doesn't mean a breed of horse, it means a color. What color? Well, a color anyhow that isn't black. Grand seemed greatly troubled. Thank you, he said warmly. How fortunate you're here to help me. But you see how difficult it is. How about glossy? Tarou suggested. Grand gazed at him meditatively, and then, yes, he exclaimed, that's good. And slowly his lips parted in a smile. Some days later, he confessed that the word flowery was bothering him considerably. As the only towns he knew were Oran and Montélimar, he sometimes asked his friends to tell him about the avenues of the Bois de Boulogne, what sort of flowers grew in them, and how they were disposed. Actually, neither Rieu nor Tarou had ever gathered the impression that those avenues were flowery, but Grand's conviction on the subject shook their confidence in their memories. He was amazed at their uncertainty. It's only artists who know how to use their eyes, was his conclusion. But one evening the doctor found him in a state of much excitement. For flowery he had substituted flower-strewn. He was rubbing his hands. At last one can see them, smell them. Hats off, gentlemen. Triumphantly he read out the sentence. One fine morning in May, a slim young horsewoman might have been seen riding a glossy sorrel mare along the flower-strewn avenues of the Bois de Boulogne. But spoken aloud, the numerous S sounds had a disagreeable effect, and Grand stumbled over them, lisping here and there. He sat down, crestfallen. Then he asked the doctor if he might go. Some hard thinking lay ahead of him. It was about this time, as was subsequently learned, that he began to display signs of an absent-mindedness in the office. A serious view was taken of these lapses of attention, as the municipality was not only working at high pressure with the reduced staff, but was constantly having new duties thrust upon it. His department suffered, and his chief took him severely to task, pointing out that he was paid to do certain work and was failing to do it as it should be done. I am told that you are acting as a voluntary helper in these sanitary groups. You do this out of office hours, so it's no concern of mine. But the best way of making yourself useful in a terrible time like this is to do your work well. Otherwise, all the rest is useless. He's right, Grand said to Ria. Yes, he's right, the doctor agreed. But I can't steady my thoughts. It's the end of my phrase that's wearing me. I don't seem able to sort it out. The plethora of sibilants in the sentence still offended his ear, but he saw no way of amending them without using what were to his mind inferior synonyms. And that flower-strewn, which had rejoiced him when he first lit on it, now seemed unsatisfactory. How could one say the flowers were strewn when presumably they had been planted along the avenues, or else grew there naturally? On some evenings, indeed, he looked more tired than Ria. Yes, this unavailing quest which never left his mind had worn him out. Nonetheless, he went on adding up the figures and compiling the statistics needed for the sanitary groups. Patiently, every evening, he brought his totals up to date, illustrated them with graphs, and racked his brains to present the data in the most exact, clearest form. Quite often he went to see Ria at one of the hospitals and asked to be given a table in an office or the dispensary. He would settle down at it with his papers, exactly as he settled down at his desk in the municipal office, and wave each completed sheet to dry the ink in the warm air, noisome with disinfectants and the disease itself. At this time he made honest efforts not to think about his horsewoman and to concentrate on what he had to do. Yes, if it is a fact that people like to have examples given to them, men of the type they call heroic, and if it is absolutely necessary that this narrator should include a hero, The narrator commends to his readers, with, to his thinking, perfect justice, this insignificant and obscure hero who had to his credit only a little goodness of heart and a seemingly absurd ideal. This will render to the truth its due, to the addiction of two and two its sum of four, and to heroism the secondary place that rightly falls to it, just after, never before, the noble claim of happiness. It would also give this chronicle its character, which is intended to be that of a narrative made with good feelings, that is to say, feelings that are neither demonstrably bad nor overcharged with emotion in the ugly manner of a stage play. Such at least was Dr. Vieux's opinion when he read in the newspapers or heard on the radio the messages and encouragement the outer world transmitted to the plague-ridden populace. Besides the comforts sent by air or overland, compassionate or admiring comments were lavished on the henceforth isolated town by way of newspaper articles or broadcast talks, and invariably their epical or prize speech verbiage jarred on the doctor. Needless to say, he knew the sympathy was genuine enough, but it could be expressed only in the conventional language with which men try to express what unites them with mankind in general, a vocabulary quite unsuited, for example, to Grand's small daily effort, and incapable of describing what Grand stood for under plague conditions. Sometimes at midnight, in the great silence of the sleep-bound town, the doctor turned his radio on before going to bed for a few hours' sleep he allowed himself, and from the ends of the earth, across thousands of miles of land and sea, kindly, well-meaning speakers tried to voice their fellow feeling, and indeed did so, but at the same time proved the utter incapacity of every man to truly share in the suffering that he cannot see. Oran, Oran! In vain the call rang over the oceans. In vain Ria listened hopefully. Always the tide of eloquence began to flow, bringing home the still more unbridgeable gulf that lay between Grand and the speaker. Oran, we're with you, they called emotionally. But not, the doctor told himself, to love or to die together. And that's the only way. They're too remote. And that's tonight's reading.